Hi, I'm Michael. Sentence correction is one of the 3 types of questions we'll see in the verbal section. In these questions, we will read a single sentence which contains an underlined portion and which is followed by 5 answers. These answers may, at first glance, sometimes seem identical to the underlined portion and to each other, but are in fact all slightly different. 4 of them have a mistake, and only 1 of them is correct. These questions test our English language proficiency and our ability to identify mistakes in grammar, terminology, and sentence construction. Preparing for these type of questions requires studying concepts such as the relationship between subjects and verbs, or between nouns and their pronouns, the different forms and tenses of verbs, and modifiers and parallelism. In each sentence correction question, the first answer choice, A, will always be identical to the underlined section in the question. Choosing it means there's nothing wrong with the original sentence. All 4 other options are alternatives to the original phrasing, only one of which can be correct. As with all verbal questions, time is of the essence. We have to identify what's wrong and figure out what's right as quickly as possible. Let's look at some examples, taken straight from the real test, with a special approval from the GMAT. Executives and federal officials say that the use of crack and cocaine is growing rapidly among workers, significantly compounding the effects of drug and alcohol abuse, which already are a cost to business of more than $100 billion a year. In this sentence, we can figure out, just by looking at it, that there's something wrong. The phrase, already are a cost to business, is wrong, since the effects cost business, but they are not a cost in themselves. But what do we do now? If what's supposed to come here isn't immediately obvious, we should take the alternative approach of checking the other answer choices. B looks good. It doesn't have the problem A had. The drugs are presented as costing, not as being a cost. But unless we're 100% certain that everything is right with it, we should look at the other options as well. C is problematic, since the phrase, already with business costs of, makes it sound as if the drugs and alcohol themselves have business costs, and not as if they create costs. Sometimes, different answers will share certain characteristics, which we can check once and thus eliminate a few answers at once. An example of this is D and E. Significant as opposed to significantly is wrong, as it's not clear what it refers to. Thus, we can eliminate them together. So this question was best answered by doing an answer comparison. But this is not always the way to go with verbal questions. First, because there's simply not enough time to read all of the answers to all of the questions and compare them, even more so if you're not a native English speaker. Second, as the answers can be very persuasive, they may lead us in wrong directions that we may not have even considered in the first place. How else can we solve them then? Let's see another example from the official test. Like Auden, the language of James Merrill is chatty, arch, and conversational, given to complex syntactic flights as well as prosaic free verse strolls. This question can be quickly solved in a precise way, since we can figure out what is wrong with the original sentence just by looking at it. How so? This question exemplifies something called parallelism. This means that when there's a connection between parts of the sentence with the same function, verbs, pronouns, clauses, etc., they must have the same form. Here, the underlined section makes the mistake of creating a parallel between 2 things which are fundamentally different: a person, Auden, and a language, that of James Merrill. As the rest of the sentence is clearly referring to a language and not to a person, chatty, conversational, syntactic, we know the correct answer must refer to Auden's language. This is exactly what answer choice C does. By adding a possessive apostrophe S, we have a parallel. Sometimes, Correcting the sentence will require we understand its logic. Pause the video and try to solve this question. The world's largest car maker announced that bonuses for its Japanese workers be raised to 2.05 million yen per person, up from 1.77 million yen last year, due to the company's forecast that it more than tripled its net profits this year to 860 billion yen. In this sentence, the company is announcing something that will happen, and thus we need the word will before be raised. Another thing that stands out is that a forecast is, by definition, of something hypothetical that happens in the future. And thus, the forecast must be that this company would triple its profits this year, and not tripled. Taken together, these corrections point to answer E. The bottom line is that, while knowing our grammatical rules is essential for sentence correction, we must still pay attention to logic. Not sure? We'll just compare the answers and see what they say. Critical reasoning is one of the three types of questions we will see in the verbal section. In this type of question, we will read a single paragraph passage in which some argument will be presented, and we'll be asked a question about it. These questions deal with one concept: how facts turn into conclusions. In other words, when we learn something new about the world, what is the basis for what we've learned? Is it only facts, or are there assumptions as well? What could make us doubt this conclusion? What could strengthen it? The arguments we read always imply a certain causation. Based on this evidence, X causes Y. And the questions require us to assess this claim. As is the case in the entire verbal section, our main challenge in these questions is time. Thus, the biggest mistake we can make is read all of the answers. Besides being incredibly time-consuming, this can also be misleading. It's like meeting 5 people who tell you a story, and you know 4 of them are lying, but they're all trained actors. These guys are so persuasive. We don't want to listen to them. We're much better off figuring out exactly what we are looking for before letting them speak. That way, we won't be fooled. Let's look at an example. You may want to pause the video and answer it. Many new hotels and resorts were constructed in Central Africa during the last decade as a result of the constant increase in the number of tourists traveling there. Nevertheless, although there was no reduction in the prevalence of the mosquitoes causing swamp fever, the number of tourists to Central Africa who suffered from the disease decreased. Which of the following, if true, most helps explain this decrease? In this question, the passage gives us enough information so we can answer the question precisely. If changes in the number of mosquitoes were not the cause of the decrease in the number of tourists suffering from swamp fever, it must be the tourists themselves who are better protected against the disease, which is exactly what C tells us. Let's look at another question. Pause the video and give it a go. Many new office buildings have emerged in St. Martin, virtually doubling the available office space. The city is expected to maintain its population and does not currently have any shortage of office space. Nevertheless, investors have almost tripled the amount they are willing to pay for any available office space or any future office building projects in the city. Which of the following, if true, most justifies the investors' willingness to pay more for office space in St. Martin? This question calls for us to approach it using the logic of pricing. If the investors are willing to pay more for the product, they must be expecting to make a higher profit off each unit of the product. But how? Well, using the same logic, we'll see there are really only 2 options here: lower cost or higher revenue. And since the passage tells us their costs are actually higher, 3 times as much, we know we are looking for an answer choice which gives us a reason as to why they can expect higher revenue. And that's exactly what C provides. Can afford higher rental rates means higher revenue. Sometimes, though, the question doesn't give us enough to go on, and we'll simply have to, as a matter of last resort, look at the answers. Growing wheat in 500 to 200 BC in the region of Damchan required the use of large quantities of water for irrigation, which had to be brought from remote locations. And yet, the Damchan people kept growing wheat, although they had the option to grow other, less water-demanding crops such as vegetables. Which of the following, if true, most helps to explain the Damchan's preference to grow wheat during the period of 500 to 200 BC? Here, we're being asked to identify a solution for a mysterious phenomena. This question requires the alternative approach of using the answers. It's not immediately obvious what the answer should be, and it seems to make sense to compare the answers. But let's do so critically, of course. A is irrelevant because it involves something which happened before the period we're discussing. Notice, we're talking about 500 to 200 BC. That's 500 to 200 before Christ. So before 500 BC is out of our range. It's not interesting. Similarly, B is irrelevant because it describes something these days and not in the relevant era. C looks promising. It tells us the reason the farmers planted these crops. But wait, we're asked why the Damchan people in general made this choice. And the ruler is part of the people. Why did the ruler order this? We don't know. It's not our answer. D doesn't help us. It describes other crops, and the fact that they weren't grown only makes the case of the wheat more mysterious. E is what we're looking for. A legitimate reason for wheat to be grown. So, to recap, we'll try to answer before reading the answers. This is the first commandment of critical reasoning questions. It's really the only way to solve all the questions in the time we are given, and it's a crucial way to avoid confusion and zero in on what we're actually looking for. Reading comprehension is one of the three types of questions we will see in the verbal section. In this type of question, we will be presented with a short academic passage, 2 or 3 paragraphs long, and will be asked 3 or 4 consecutive questions about it. We should expect to see about 4 passages in each verbal section, making for about 12 to 16 questions out of a total of 37. These questions are the only ones on the GMAT which are not adaptive. Once we get a passage, the questions that come with it are set and won't change according to our performance. However, the passages themselves as a whole are adaptive. The ones you see will depend on how you are doing on the test up till that point. So, what do we need in order to succeed in this type of question? 3 things are needed for success: quick reading, speedy analysis, and a time-saving problem-solving strategy. Let's talk about these 3 skills one by one. First of all, reading. The first thing we need to do is read the entire passage. And since each passage is 200 to 250 words, and in the verbal, time is especially tight, we better do this quickly. This means we need to work on our speed reading ability. That's especially the case if we are non-native English speakers, but also if we are native speakers but are unfamiliar with academic writing. Thus, we should spend at least 75 consecutive minutes every day for at least a few weeks before the exam reading articles from popular science or business magazines. 75 minutes because that's the time we have to complete the verbal section. Since our time is short, we can't afford to first read and only then start thinking about what we read. Academic reading is very different from reading literature, where we can read leisurely and wait till we've gotten to the end of a text to reflect on how it made us feel. Here, we need to analyze what we're reading while we're reading it. The method we recommend to accomplish this is that of active reading. While reading the passage, we'll stop every sentence or two to make sure we understood what we've just read, ask ourselves questions to make sure we understand how one paragraph connects to the other, and most importantly, take short notes about the main message of each paragraph or sentence. We will continually ask ourselves, what has the passage told us up to now? How did what we just read connect to everything that came before it? To do this, it's extremely helpful to pay attention to the connecting words. Negative connectors, such as however, although, and instead, signal that one idea contradicts or weakens another, while positive connectors, such as furthermore, additionally, and moreover, signal that one idea builds upon or strengthens another. The third thing we must do is approach RC passages strategically. First of all, we'll read the whole text and only approach the questions after we're done. Second, we'll use different strategies for different types of questions. If the question asks us about a specific place in the passage, great. No need to waste time reading the answers. We can use the precise approach and extract the answer straight from the text. If we're not sure what we are looking for, we can use the alternative approach and just eliminate the wrong answers. For example, we may want to do this if we're asked, what would an appropriate title for this passage be? Thinking of a title on our own makes less sense than comparing the answers. A word of caution, though. We'll only do this when we have to, since reading answers is both time-consuming and confusing, as the different answer choices can be very persuasive. Finally, we may need to use the logical approach in questions, which require us to analyze the claim made in the argument. If, for example, we're asked about evidence which would weaken or strengthen an argument made in the passage, we need to think logically about what it is the passage is claiming. So, the bottom line is that since lack of time is the #1 killer in the verbal section, and reading comprehension requires a lot of reading, we must read fast, read as little as we can, and apply the best solution strategy.